Hello to our online viewers. Welcome to episode 3, season 2 of the Frick Pittsburgh's Unofficial Gilded Age Aftershow. I'm Amanda Gillen, director of the learning department here at the Frick, and I have 2 different Frick colleagues on screen with me today. With us is Morgan Lawrence, the Frick's collection manager. Morgan has been here for a few years now. She's responsible for many things related to our collection, and she takes care of CLAYTON, which is the Frick family historic home we've been referencing and talking about, and we'll talk more about today. Also with us, hooray, is Kelsie Paul. Kelsie is in the learning department with me. She is our manager of interpretation. She is still technically on maternity leave. I told everybody you were off with your first little beautiful baby boy, but she agreed. She loves the after show. She agreed to come back and go right on screen with us. So Kelsie, thank you for being with us. I know you have fans who will be happy to see you back.
That's very sweet. I'm very excited to be back in the saddle.
I was telling Kelsie, and I've been trying to channel her in guiding us through the after show conversations. We have a big episode to talk about. I feel like every episode this season has more and more happening, so we can dive right in and start with, what the Gilded Age show does really well, which is a party, a dinner, an event, a luncheon. They do these events so well on the show, and we have a very high stakes luncheon happening in the Russell household. Bertha is still fighting the opera battle and really pitting her new Metropolitan Opera cause against the Academy is what they call it, I think, right? The sort of existing opera house. Anybody want to take us through the luncheon? What's happening? There's also a couple of dramatic things that are revealed with Turner, the former lady's maid who shows up. So we can just dive in and start there if that works.
Yeah, I think, obviously Bertha she's always scheming, and she's always plotting her next sort of move. And she seems to be in this stage where she realizes that she does need support from some of the old money families. And so the best way to do that is sort of to court their interest. And so she's inviting very specific people to kind of come over and try to sway her. But she drops this bomb on everyone, which is that not only are they opening this new opera house, but they are going to open their season on the very same night as the Academy is. And we learn later that the Academy sort of has this set date that everybody knows. And so it's very intentional on Bertha's part to make that move. And she's kind of throwing down a gauntlet to make people choose sides. And I think my favorite part is War McAllister, just like leaving one party and going across the street to go meet with Caroline Astor, and she asks if he had to come far, and he says, no, not really. Like, I didn't have to come that far. So he is playing both sides. But yeah, Turner is definitely the most interesting guest, and they have quite the tete-a-tete between the two of them at the end of that little party.
Talk about McAllister for 1 second, because his face, you're right, when he did not know that Bertha Russell was going to choose that date, he looked as surprised as anybody that she's taking a stand, but also making him choose. What do you think his game is, playing both Caroline Astor and Bertha Russell? Is he just sort of enjoying the machinations here, or trying to have it both ways? Like, what? He's stuck now.
It makes me think that he is just such a fan of being everybody's go-to person as far as information and social resources, and being that extension of the uppermost ranks of societal power in Manhattan at this time. And I think it was incredibly intentional of Bertha to finally force his hand to make a choice. And that is, it's either new money or old money, pick your player. And I thought it was super interesting, the phrase of, I think, Mrs. Astor calling the Academy's date for the opera's opening night sacred. They were quite literally putting this evening within like a pool of almost godlike language, where using the word sacred and being so aghast at someone choosing this date for a new opera house. And I can't wait to see who Ward is going to pick. And I keep going back and forth between who it could be.
In these very difficult times, it is sort of fun to watch people just fussing over what seems like nothing isn't nothing to them, but it's, I don't know, to me that was very enjoyable watching the machinations. We go from seeing Bertha sort of commanding power, setting the state, owning the luncheon, owning the room, to being really shocked and upset with Turner, her former lady's maid, who's now Mrs.
Mrs. Winterton.
Winterton, right, as a guest, and Turner sort of sticks it to Bertha, right, in this episode.
Yeah, it's not very often that we see Bertha kind of on her heels. She is usually kind of the one charging ahead and taking control. She's very confident usually, and you can see how that flips in that scene where suddenly she is on the defense and Turner has dropped this bomb on her, that is about this massive betrayal. And then obviously she then has to take that, and we can talk about the conversation with her and George afterwards, but yeah, it's an interesting shift in the power dynamic, because the last time that we saw them interact, Turner was the lady's maid. She was coming from a much less powerful place. Bertha was her employer and in charge, and now suddenly they are social peers in a way. And even though Bertha has dirt on Turner because she knows that she's a former lady's maid, but now Turner has this other dirt on her. And so it's very interesting to kind of see like who's going to blink first and maybe who's going to use that against each other. But they are more evenly matched than I think Bertha thought that they would be, because Turner has this dirt on her. So it's very interesting to watch that.
Just to how marriage at this time kind of can be everything.
Oh yeah.
For Bertha Russell with her own daughter with Gladys, and then Agnes Van Ryn with Marion, who you marry. And look at the difference here. Turner goes from being a servant. She marries this older rich man, and suddenly all these doors are open. She has power literally just by the fact of getting married and who she married. It's so interesting. Bertha is hurt and betrayed, and this will come up again. We'll talk about the union situation, because she still does her duty and her job, in terms of helping her husband along. Morgan, if you want to talk just a second, I think we'll add in some photos of CLAYTON dining and the etiquette of dining. We in our historic house have dishes and glassware, and you have worked many times to set a beautiful table in CLAYTON. It's not just about beauty though. It does matter. I mean, the idea of a formal dining room and staging and hosting events and luncheons like this really mattered to the social fabric, correct? Like sort of at the upper classes at the time.
Oh, it definitely does. I feel like everything in the Gilded Age era, between how your table looks and the exterior of your house and how your hair is pinned back, it all is a reflection of your social status and is at the heart of everything that you try to evoke every second of every day, especially for these insanely wealthy upper class families. And I will say the dining room at CLAYTON is a little bit easier to manage than the ones that we've seen in the Gilded Age. And I myself don't need to take a ruler like some of their staff would have to measure out our place settings so that every utensil is an equal distance from the other. But all of the objects inside of our collection that we're able to use on some of our table settings that, as Amanda said, are pictured throughout this presentation. They are both beautiful and ornate, but also functional as well. And every single utensil and piece of glassware has a purpose, and most of the time it's a very unique purpose. And I by no means specialize in decorative arts, and I was mind blown that we have things in our collection that were only crafted to hold candy or bullion or something of that nature, where it is so fitted to only one specific thing, and it would be kind of wild to use it in any other way while you're hosting anybody within your space or just being there yourself.
Highly inappropriate to use the wrong the wrong utensil for the wrong thing.
That would be a no in Mrs. Russell's household.
And that's how you know. That's how you know if you're in or out, right? Like that's a demarcation of your own kind of social knowledge. Is, do you know that you only use this fork for this thing? I know, again, not to jump ahead to the lunch with Henderson, the union man, but I did notice when he's having lunch with Bertha and George, like his table manners are a little different, and he's not paying attention to kind of how he's eating or anything like that, because he's just a normal dude. Like he doesn't care or you have any idea what that social stuff is like. And so, yeah, being able to show up and use the right fork and use the right cup at the right time and drink in a certain way, like that is how you demonstrate that you deserve to be there. And it's a lot of pressure for a meal. I just want to eat,
Right. Just enjoy your appetizer in peace and choose to use a fork or not.
Yeah. Our dinners in front of the TV, at least mine, on rough days. I was just going to say something, Clayton. Oh, I will put in and we'll move on. A shameless plug for Clayton. We said when season 1 of the after show was out, our historic house was closed, but it is open to tour, and we will be very soon switching the house over from our Gilded is Not Golden signature tour that we've talked about to our holiday tour called Home for the Holidays. So if you are in Pittsburgh or close to Pittsburgh, we do decorate. The dining room will be changed. We'll be talking actually quite a bit about food and foodways and how food brings people together at the holidays. So always like to mention our place and hope that some of you will come and see us. Well, let's give a little attention to Ada. We haven't talked a whole lot about her in the prior 2 episodes, and her minister, Reverend, and how she has a little date and it's getting really cute. They are starting to be maybe a little bit of a couple. What do you guys think?
I don't know. It's so hard to say in like the 1880s, like what is dating and what is being a couple in the 1880s. But it is also interesting, I think, to watch Ada navigate kind of the social expectations of what might end up being kind of a courtship, because she is older. And as Agnes likes to point out at any opportunity, she has been a spinster at, up until this point. And I think she herself never really thought that she would be courted or in any kind of like relationship at that point. So you can see how she's kind of not really sure what she's supposed to do, but yet she still, because people in this world at this time just, naturally knew, she still is aware of kind of what is expected of her. And so her going to Marion and saying like, not only do I need to kind of like maybe tell a little white lie so that Agnes doesn't know where I'm going, but there is still that pressure of like, it's not appropriate for her to show up there necessarily by herself. And, even though he's a reverend or whatever. And so, Marion offering to kind of escort her there and then like take a walk outside so that they can have their time together. But the decorum of, a single woman, even at Ada's age, the fact that she is a full grown woman, she is not a teenager, but she has to think about sort of what this looks like. And you can see that she's nervous, but she really wants to go, and she doesn't think he's going to show, and then he's there, and it's very sweet.
It's very sweet. And I loved the scheming. We talked in another episode about Ada and Marion and how they have this sort of bond, and not conspiring necessarily in a bad way against Agnes, but they help each other to do what it is that they want to do. And Ada's been getting bolder and getting some opportunities of her own, which is really nice. Anything to add to that, Morgan, or anything else about Ada?
Oh, I just think that it is so incredibly sweet to see Ada fully come out of her shell, not only with her romantic interests, but also like some of the personal interests. And the scene, especially when they were all having lunch together after the soup incident, or maybe beforehand.
For lunch.
It's
on my table.
But it was so funny and comical. And who wouldn't want a bowl of clam chowder soup right now? But to see her actually stand up to her sister in a way when they were talking about the watercolors, and how she actually does have a favorite artist. And it wasn't just this kind of way to create a falsified common interest between her and the Reverend, but something that they would actually have in common together. And so seeing her in these little smaller passive ways make her own space for herself and leaning towards her feelings towards this man was amazing to see. Fully Team Ada.
Yeah, there's a lot to her, like there is to every person, and it hasn't been shown. And Agnes is really, increasingly kind of snide and harsh, and these digs that are made to trying to make Ada look simple or small or to embarrass her, and it's not really working, although Agnes did have some great one-liners, like you said, with things. But I think that's coming also out of fear. Like Agnes, Ada has been her lifelong companion, and now there are these moments where she's maybe starting to think like this might change. I don't know. It's just interesting to think about Agnes and how she's trying to control all the people around her. We talked about this last episode, and Ada is not necessarily having it anymore. So I agree with that.
And just how she has such a different reaction between Ada possibly getting married versus how she reacts to both Marion and Oscar in those same situations too. And I wonder if she's almost thinking that, wow, all three of them could be gone and I could very well just be alone here, maybe for the first time in her entire life.
Yeah.
Left behind Armstrong.
Yeah, she's she I think she's nervous about what that could mean. And I think it's so funny to just see kind of that like sister dynamic between Ada and Agnes. And clearly Agnes is used to being the sister in charge. She's the older sister. She's the one that sort of calls the shots. And yeah, I don't think she's used to Ada kind of not even standing up for herself, but just sort of like being her own person and being willing to kind of put herself out on a limb a little bit. And so, yeah, Agnes is, I think, in for a big change. I don't know. She's watching her world get rocked in a different way, I think, than she's used to. So, yeah, we'll see how she does with that.
We were talking in prep, how much we all really love the scene of the watercolor, the art exhibition that Ada and the minister go to. This show seems to and does a really nice job of anchoring scenes in cultural events. There are several, referenced in this episode: the opera, which we don't see yet, but they're talking about, and then the art exhibition, and then the Oscar Wilde play, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But we, as part of the Frick Pittsburgh, we also have an art museum. So the three of us and everybody here works with art exhibitions as well, and other things. I love that, how it was in that room. I love that there were people in there, the stands, the sort of A-frame, display in the middle. It was very genteel and lovely and a different kind of scene. I enjoyed that, I think, most out of anything. It was just a nice scene. I don't know, different. I hadn't really thought about what art exhibitions looked like in that time period, like what it would be for them. It was fun.
It was so incredibly interesting to see. I work really closely with our physical installations of art exhibitions here at the Frick Pittsburgh, and to be able to see how presentations looked in the 1880s versus what they look like now, both the changes that are made in so many different institutions, but how some things remain the same. Just like seeing a painting hung on the wall and trying to think about, they probably use a lot of the same mechanics that we use now, and seeing how their space looks like and how people are interacting in this like one circular motion and taking their time to just walk through and admire, and not really seeing, at least from that vantage point, any kind of labels that we're really used to in museums right now. So it's kind of like going in there, I'm sure you could wander in not knowing what's happening, but also people that are actively buying and trying to form their own art collections, whatever that means to them during that time, and already knowing what it is they're looking at, the artist, and what they're taking home.
Oh, thank you for that. I didn't think about that connection with you, because you do hang our shows and work with our paintings, and it is really fun to think about. The Oscar Wilde play, Oscar Wilde himself makes an appearance. The play scene is actually very, very funny, because everyone who we know in that audience is clearly kind of bored, kind of confused, kind of waiting for it to end. And then there's a reception afterward with Oscar himself, where they're trying to diplomatically and you can't put much past Oscar Wilde, but they're trying to sort of, navigate a conversation with him. He really did come to the US in the early 1880s. And Kelsie, I think you looked into this a little bit for us.
Yeah. So, one of the things I think that is maybe the most fun about this show is that we do get real historical figures that kind of get dropped in sort of amongst our fictional characters. And so it's always fun to kind of sit there and Google, like, is that a real person or is that not a real person? And obviously, I think most people are familiar, at least with Oscar Wilde by name, if you're not familiar with his work. But he did come to the US in the early 1880s. He made 2 trips. He was actually here for a much longer tour the year before our show is set. So 1882, he came for a pretty extended lecture series, traveling the US. And then he returned, what we're seeing, in August of 1883 for the very first stage production of one of his works. That was the first time that he had ever actually staged a play. And it was in New York at the Union Square Theater. And the reaction from our characters is accurate. Everyone hated it. They thought it was terrible. And it only ran for a week, apparently, and then got pulled from the stage. So yeah, it was panned by the critics. Audiences didn't like it. It's a play. We were wondering kind of what the play was. It's a play called Vera or the Nihilists, and it's about a Russian peasant girl who joins a bunch of revolutionaries, of all things, and everyone hated it. So as Oscar Van Ryn said, it was interesting, but yeah, it didn't do well. So, you know, we're seeing in the show, you know, an Oscar Wilde who is really early in his career. He doesn't write Picture of Dorian Gray or The Importance of Being Earnest until kind of like the early to mid 1890s. So he's in the show, the Oscar that we see is kind of really at the beginning of his career, and he clearly has a reputation, but he's not the really like famous playwright or writer that he becomes kind of in the 1890s. So yeah, it was an interesting cameo to have him in there, and to have him sort of, you know, making commentary on our characters and sort of what's going on.
Yeah, and where was that reception after? Was it at the venue at the theater, or did they go here where they go?
It seems like they're at Aurora's house, because she seems to be the hostess. She and her husband are sort of introducing him to everyone. So I assumed that it was her home.
You're right. Aurora is a real social linchpin, I feel like. They use the writers use her as like the person who plans the events that gets everybody together. Right. So Oscar Wilde is there and he's sort of making some observations. Oscar Van Ryn runs into the man, and I should remember his name, who had been his boyfriend or his companion.
Adams.
John Adams.
John Adams. Oh yeah.
Right. Because I was like,
something.
Really? That's right. He runs into John Adams and they're talking, and they clearly have affection for each other. They've had a relationship. There's an intimacy there. And Oscar Wilde is kind of observing that from across the room and being like,
Aurora's just kind of like, what? And he's just like, oh, sweet girl. Like, you just like, he's like, you don't know. And that's fine. But he's like, I'm picking up on what's going on over there. So.
And it was so interesting, like this complete stranger who is really quirky and a little bit weird, just coming into this mix and immediately picking up on so many different things with the people that he has such a small interaction with. And then Aurora maybe is just completely oblivious that Oscar is gay and was in a relationship with John Adams, or something that she just never wanted to admit to herself. And it took the other Oscar Wilde all of like 3 minutes to pick up on so many different things happening within that social gathering.
That's a good point. And Oscar Van Ryn is attending this play with the young woman who he's interested in now. I can't remember her name either.
I think Miss Beaton.
Maud Beaton.
Maud Beaton, that's right. So they're sort of starting, after meeting in Newport last episode, they're clearly starting to spend some time together. So we'll see where that goes in coming episodes. Yeah. There's little things you got to pay attention to. They advance each storyline. Like some get moved very far forward. Others, like little things happen. Yeah. We can turn to some more serious topics. Peggy's storyline. Peggy has a pretty important shift in her professional career in this episode. So we know she's back in the Van Ryn household. She's working for Agnes again as her secretary. She seems to be happy and settled in there and back with Marion. She is also still working at the newspaper. So she's not giving up on her her writing or her, dreams of being a journalist and continuing that work. And an opportunity comes up with the newspaper owner, with her boss, who is going down to stay with Booker T. Washington and visit Tuskegee Institute and write an article about a new girls' dormitory that's opening down there. And Peggy winds up, she wants to go. Morgan, you did some research into this. Do you want to give us some context for what's happening and why this was important and what Peggy wants to do?
Yeah, definitely. And for Peggy, in her own kind of life context, I think it's extremely important to always keep in mind that she is actively mourning and will most likely be mourning for the rest of her life after knowing that she just lost her child. And so right now we kind of see her in this place where she's trying to function on in her daily life and using different parts of her work to be able to use as distractions, momentary distractions from this grief of child loss. And so seeing her wanting to take this opportunity both as a professional writer and somebody who has always wanted to write pieces that would change the lives of her fellow humans, and also seeing her break down with her mother in that bedroom scene about how she still needs work at the core of her daily activities right now as that distraction, and how this could be another extension of that. And so right now, we found out that Peggy has never been past the Mason and Dixon line, and she has always lived in the North. But we are really revealed by her mother's dialogue with her that her mother, it seems like she has traveled or has either lived or has been forcibly enslaved in a southern state. I'm not sure about her father. And also her boss, he revealed as well that he was forcibly enslaved before the Civil War. And so she is right now the only person in the Gilded Age show who has not been forcibly enslaved before, but she has no doubt experienced so many different forms and ripples of racism and the institution of slavery in the United States. And so we are being taken, I would think, in our next episode, either her traveling to the South or her already being there with Booker T. Washington and his wife, where they are going to be staying during their reporting of the Tuskegee Institute. And so it's in Tuskegee, Alabama, and the school itself opened in, I believe, 1881. And it was an extremely small plot that Booker T. Washington was able to acquire at first. And then by 1883, I believe he was able to purchase another 100 acres of a former plantation site. And over the next couple of years, they were able to construct their own kiln on site and be able to produce bricks that they then in turn were able to sell to raise money. And within a few years, they were able to expand from a very small shanty to a classroom, a dining hall, a girls' dormitory, and a chapel. And so Peggy is going in around, I think, 1883. So really, she's going into this massive expansion that's happening at Tuskegee. And she's going to witness firsthand and be able to record and produce a huge thought stream that's happening within our society right now that Booker T. Washington becomes the head of and one of the main figures of advancing life after both the Civil War and then getting into Reconstruction, which was trying to weave back together all of these fractures that became the United States after the Civil War, and getting right into Jim Crow. So right now she is in basically another kind of cannon ready to go off, and switching from physical violence that was the Civil War, fighting in many senses, both with your brain, with your body, with anything you had in your arsenal, both passive and active, to achieve citizenship for men, women, children who are Black Americans at this time, but were always treated in most of these cases in the southern states as subhuman. and going into a time where that fight from the Civil War and figuring things out through Reconstruction with citizenship to a huge battle of legality through Southern and Northern states at this time. And so going to the South is, like Peggy's mother said, extremely dangerous. And you can just watch her heart break for so many different reasons that we can't even begin to understand. And hearing her say that she's trying to keep Peggy alive by telling her these things, as far as don't look any white person in the eye, make yourself basically as small and invisible as possible, do not go anywhere alone. That is advice that is not, as Peggy put it, her mother trying to make her subservient, but trying to preserve her life, not even her personality or her essence, but quite literally just her life at this point. And so it was something that I am curious in the next couple of episodes how they're going to take this travel, especially with Peggy traveling both to and from Alabama with only a married man. And so that was another layer to this story as well, with the danger of travel. Not only do you have so many opportunities for the ways in which you travel to go wrong, but also the further south that you get and the further that you run into these more rural areas of southern states where information and national changes and movements were a lot harder to spread to smaller rural communities, both in the North and the South, due to communication limitations and the ability to conceal and warp information. But also how each kind of community at this time used these kind of national movements towards molded it into their own sort of way of life. And so I'm very, very curious to see how it's going to be taken in the next couple of episodes.
Peggy's mother has become a really strong character, I think. And that scene between the two of them, she's really, as you said, emotional about, she's learning this, like, what are you doing? Her daughter's, packing. I as a mom, of a young woman, I know that moment where you're like, wait, what are you doing? What is it you think you're going to do? And then sort of like responding to that. And Peggy is a grown woman, but her mom is clearly terrified, has clearly had experiences that Peggy hasn't had. We talked about this in another episode with Alana. She's trying to warn her child, and you can see Peggy's face. She's like, yeah, it's gonna be okay, Mom. Like, she knows that it could potentially be dangerous, but her mother clearly has lived experience that she is like worrying about her girl and not wanting her to go down there. We'll see what happens. I admire Peggy's spunk, and she wants to go and she wants to make a difference. And right, that's when she then cries too and tells her mother, like, I need to do these things. Like, this is, I'm trying to keep busy. I keep thinking about my child. So they really set that up for a complicated, we'll see what happens next episode. I'm worried about it. I don't want anything to happen to Peggy, but we'll see what happens. And even Marion is like, you can't be traveling with this man, right? Wasn't it Marion who was just sort of like,
yeah.
So, and Marion's pretty bold. So we'll see if anything happens with that. He better leave Peggy alone. I think he's honorable, but we'll see what happens.
And it seems like they have like a solid friendship. I'm not sure if it'll change in the coming episodes, but yeah, seeing all of those different social relationships play out and how Peggy is going to both leave Manhattan and then how she's going to be coming back. I'm very interested to see that kind of the character change based on her own lived experiences that are going to impact both her as a person and also her professional life and her personal life.
Yeah, I think that scene between Peggy and Dorothy is really powerful for a lot of reasons, but I think it's not that Peggy has not come across racism in her life. She obviously has, and there is just as much racism and racial prejudice in the North during this time period, and we've seen some of that on the show, the way that she's had people treat her differently because of the color of her skin. But it's clear that Dorothy feels like she doesn't quite understand how different and how extreme it is in this time period. in the South. And I think, we've talked about the fact that it's easy in a show like The Gilded Age to just think about the Gilded Age, the era, as this glitzy, glamour, glittery parties and, all of the amazing costumes and all of these things. But it is important to think about what else is happening concurrently in American history at that time. And this was the rise of Jim Crow. And so it's a totally different environment in the South. And I think I'm glad that they've included this storyline. I think they're expanding the world so much by taking Peggy down there and kind of showing what was going on outside of New York City. So it's going to be really interesting, I think, to watch that progress. And yeah, I hope she's okay, but I think it will be an eye-opening experience for her for sure.
The season has been so good, much richer than season one, which I think happens, the characters, you can expand the storyline, but they are going in those directions. You're right, because it isn't all, it would be as we, with our work here, this is what we do here with Clayton. It is not all parties and luncheons and opera dates. There is a lot more to the late 19th century in American history than that. You both are absolutely right. Another big part, we'll wrap up with our Pittsburgh portion of the show, because obviously we're thrilled that Pittsburgh is part of the storyline. They didn't go to Pittsburgh yet, but Pittsburgh came to the Russell household in the form of Henderson, Union Man Henderson. Kelsie, you want to talk a little bit about this and sort of what plays out for Russell and Henderson?
Yeah, I mean, it's always fun to kind of see a snippet of something and you're familiar with in a show like The Gilded Age. So yeah, it's fun to kind of have Pittsburgh getting some shout outs here and there. And I hope that we do get to see more of Pittsburgh in later episodes. But Henderson shows up at the Russell house, and the idea is that George is going to kind of wine and dine him a little bit, and he's going to use that as an opportunity to maybe do a little negotiating, but maybe more do a little bribing, which is he thinks it's just going to be enough to throw money at Henderson, the individual, and see how that's going to shake out. And as a result of that, we get this really fascinating conversation between Henderson and George. And what I found so interesting is that they manage to kind of outline the two sides of this labor issue that is really exploding in the 1880s and the 1890s. That is a time period where, this question that I believe Henderson poses, which is, can workers win against capital? That is really the kind of core question that was being fought in the 1880s and 1890s across all industries in the United States, not just steel. And so we're seeing that kind of play out between George and Henderson. And you really see in the way that George kind of pushes back against some of the claims that Henderson is making, or the points that Henderson is trying to make. You really see sort of the mindset of the men that George is kind of representing, and these industrialist types who really just believed that they didn't owe their workers anything. It was all about the market and the way that the market played out. The market was its own animal, and you needed to let it sort of take you where it was going to. And this mindset of, life is dangerous, people die, but, as long as progress is being made, that's the most important thing. And George makes this point about the Brooklyn Bridge, saying that, well, the Brooklyn Bridge is a great thing, but people had to die to build it. So, should we not have it because it's dangerous? And it's such a flippant, sort of perspective. And it's like, well, sure, it's easy to have that perspective on progress when you're not the one that is doing the work, right? He's making all of the money off of it, but he's not the one out there working in the steel mills or building the Brooklyn Bridge. And so it's like, okay, George, like, thank you, like, that's but he obviously, that's the perspective that a lot of these men had, which is just that this was the way of the world, this was the way that the market and the economy needed to work, and if you happened to be on the bottom of that, then that sucks for you. That's sort of just where you were. But it was a really interesting kind of conversation. And I know we wanted to talk about too, because Henderson talks a little bit about what it's like to be a steel worker in Pittsburgh. And that's something that we obviously in our line of work talk a lot about. I'll give a shout out to our friends over at Rivers of Steel. If you are ever in Pittsburgh and you want to learn more about what it was like to work in the steel industry, definitely go check out their sites. They're an incredible organization, and we have learned so much about what it was like to live in Pittsburgh at that time from them. So I have, a couple of things that I can share. Henderson talks about, I wrote down the quote because I thought it was a really powerful one. When describing to George what it's like to be a steelworker in Pittsburgh in 1883, he says, "It's an existence, it's not a life." And we have some images that we're going to share, here to kind of illustrate that a little bit. If you were a steelworker in the 1880s, you were probably a recent immigrant from Eastern Europe or Southern Europe. Some of the skilled and higher paid workers would have been Irish and British immigrants who had come over a little bit earlier. They were often the leaders of the unions, which is what I think we're kind of seeing with Henderson and sort of his compatriots. But it's not an easy life by any means. And steel workers, they lived in mill towns right next to the steel mills where they worked. So we have some images of just the environment of living near a steel mill and what that means. It's not a clean place to live. The air is not clean. And that would have been impacting the way that you live. But it was also really dangerous work. And Henderson talks about that, and the fact that, it was not easy. They're working 16-hour days. There is no OSHA. There are no worker safety kind of requirements in the 1880s. And so, there wasn't a lot of recourse for workers if they were injured on the job. And I have some data that I can share because, there's been a lot of research that's been done about kind of, what it was like and kind of the financial aspects for steelworkers. So first, to put it in perspective, in 1885, in a steel mill outside of Pittsburgh, pay rates for a steelworker were anywhere from $1.04 to $1.50 a day. And so when you compare that to, the kind of money that a George Russell is making, that's a totally different life. But that monetary value was also assigned to the workers themselves and to their health and their safety and their lives. At the end of the episode, the workers talk about striking and they talk about being willing to die, for this cause, which seems extreme to us, I think. But when you realize that their work was already life or death, it's not as extreme of a sacrifice as you would maybe think. And the steel industry recognized how dangerous it was because they assigned monetary values to their workers' lives. So if you were killed on the job in a steel mill, your family might get up to 6,000 days worth of pay for your life. That was what you were worth, to your steel mill. And that's only if they could find your family or if they even cared to make that payout. But by comparison, your thumb was worth 600 days of lost wages. So you lose your thumb, they'll pay you 600 days of lost wages, but then they probably expect you to come back to work because, like, hey, you can probably work without one of your thumbs. But your eye, if you lost your eye, you'd be paid out for maybe the equivalent of 1,800 days of lost work because your eye is maybe a little bit more important than your thumb. So, it's really interesting. And I think that's something that George clearly doesn't understand. Henderson is trying to get him to understand. But you can see that disconnect between someone like George, who is making the money off of this industry, but he clearly doesn't understand what the daily, life is like for his workers, versus Henderson, who is there and knows what it's like and is trying to express that to him. So that sort of collision between management and labor is something that we saw a lot in this time period, and we're obviously going to see more in the show. So it's going to be great to see how that plays out, because it's got some real life historical implications for sure.
Yeah. And as we all predicted, when we knew the storyline was coming, Henderson would not be bought. Russell's bribing him with a position in management. You can, your wife can stop sewing, and Henderson's like, it's not even a question. I mean, he is, which we all knew, a Pittsburgh worker is not going to be swayed by the New York money. I'm proud of him for that. You knew he wasn't going to take that bribe, but he clearly was just like, I see what we're doing here. This is not, and he made that trip to New York and then he makes it back to Pittsburgh, and clearly setting up for conflict. We'll see what happens. I mean, this could go a lot of different ways in the next couple of episodes. And I don't know that Russell knows what he's in in for. It's going to be, I think, a shock to him how powerful the resistance in Pittsburgh is going to be. So, yeah, it's quite a storyline. Again, so much happened in this episode. I feel like we touched on most of it, but they're just really putting a lot out there for us. And of course, we are loving it. Loving doing this. Thank you all again for being with us for episode 3. We'll see what Sunday night brings us. I always have this moment on Sunday afternoon where I remember, like, oh, the Gilded Age is on.
Something to look forward to.
Exactly. So we'll do this again. Morgan, thank you for all your thoughtful research and your commentary. Kelsie, thank you for taking a day off of maternity leave to be with us, not just working, but coming on screen is what to come back and do.
It was fun.
My heart is happy with having you with us and getting to do this conversation with you both. So thank you to our viewers for sticking with us. Think about coming to Clayton. Think about visiting us. And we'll see you again next week for episode 4. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.